I wrote at the bottom of my notes on what you said, Polly, a question which I hope we'll come back to is, what do we do about this? I'd like to introduce a gentleman I only just met this evening, but I'm delighted to meet because he's written quite an extraordinary book called What Price Liberty? And as I'm introducing everyone with an accolade, he gets one also, which was he was the only non-fiction writer to appear on Waterstone's 25 Authors of the Future list a few years ago. So Ben, I wonder what you make of all this.
Thank you very much. Well, I come here as a historian, I think, rather than someone that's actually engaged in politics. And I should start by saying something which is sort of a theme of my book. It might sound like quite an obvious thing, but it's the constant need for renewal within a political system. It's something that I'm a historian, and I approached trying to explain liberty in a historical way, because we're not looking for fundamental laws or for things that we can go back to or return to. What I mean when I talk about history being important in all these things is, first of all, it shows the contradictions, the compromises that are needed to establish things like liberty or democracy. It shows that it's a never-ending process to battle for these things, that we always, one of the conditions of living in a free society is having the energy, the determination to go out there and fight for it. And we find those lessons in history, a historical way of thinking rather than concrete historical lessons. So democracy is a Sisyphean task. Like liberty, we're always fighting, we're always struggling for it, we never get to the end. It's very important that we understand that, and it's one of the things I think which has dropped away from education, from public life generally, is that use of history in that kind of way. Thomas Paine once wrote that freedom in Britain was entirely due to the constitution of the people and nothing to do with the constitution of the state, which I think is a theme of British history. And I think it's true of any society, whether it's got a written constitution, a fundamental document. Britain was characterised by people who had the guts and determination to go out and scrap for liberty, scrap for democracy, keep the government to account. We have some wonderful lessons, Levellers, the Painite radicals of the late 18th century, fight for the trades union movement, but also ordinary people that thought enough is enough. We also have a history of a few maybe independently minded politicians who have worked within the system. These voices from outdoors are often written out of history. They're often obscure people that flourished briefly and then disappeared. And it reflects, I think, the reason why we don't have the fundamental document or the fundamental revolution that we can go back to when we think about renewing democracy is because there's always a bargain in British parliamentary system. The state guaranteed that it played by the rules, that it stuck to laws. It guaranteed people for a long time, it gave people the idea that they didn't need to worry so much about things like democracy if they were given things like what we call negative liberty, the ability to exist within your private sphere and do what you like. No one was going to tell you how many glasses of wine you could have at an evening or how you should plant your garden. And that was the kind of bargain that existed. It was quite a shabby one. It didn't mean that the political system was any better. It was an alibi for not reforming the system. But beneath all that, and part of this history, the vibrant republican tradition of British history, which goes back to the 17th century, maybe even before, and that goes beyond the negative liberty. It's the obligation that you have to be part of society. You have to participate if you want to enjoy full liberty. It's something that, I again say, is something that's kind of brushed out of history. It's the idea that a free society is more than its laws, is more than its constitution, is more than the way that MPs behave. It's a kind of babbling, conversational, argumentative kind of society where people care, they go out, they feel plugged into this sort of legacy of freedom, this legacy of discussion, dissent and argument. So whenever we talk about reform, we have to think about what the end point is of this, that it's the kind of free society that we want, and that any kind of top-down reform has to include things that involve participation, and that's absolutely vital. It's part of our history, and we forget it. I think, when we talk about these things, because we live in a society which is disengaged from that spirit which brought about liberty and democracy in the first place. Democratic renewal. Can we take for granted the fact that people will go out, will find value in fighting these long and sometimes tedious, sometimes difficult battles? There is a desire to participate, I think. I think it's a human, part of our human nature, I think, to desire liberty, to feel that our voice is heard and feel that our voice can have some kind of influence. But that voice is thwarted, and it's been thwarted for a long time. Very simple example, if you did want to go out and protest and do it, it's incredibly hard these days. I speak to people throughout the country who wouldn't dare go out into their, market town to protest, even though they want to. And these aren't students; these are well-dressed, middle-class people with grandchildren who are kind of itching to protest, but feel scared and feel that they're going to be watched, surveilled by the state. So it's a dissatisfaction with politics which long predates the scandals of 2009. The idea that there's been no sort of channels for people to participate in politics, and to feel that the door of not just politics but the door of the state is closing against them. To use a wonderful phrase from British history, the state is seen as overmighty. The goal of the last few years was to make a more efficient, streamlined, cost-effective, consumer-focused public services. However laudable all those things, increasingly it doesn't have a human face. It seems to exclude people. People feel that data is being used and they have no control over it, and that anti-terror laws are routinely used against ordinary people, going beyond the purpose that Parliament gave it. And that, as the Washington Post said, we're the premier surveillance society in the world, the innovator of surveillance in the world. So it makes it, even if the state isn't authoritarian, it makes it look authoritarian or controlling. And that's a voice that you hear again and again, and it tends to push a certain amount of people to the extremes, a kind of Jeremy Clarkson types of libertarianism, of sticking two fingers up to the state, which isn't particularly constructive, but it's the way that these policies have been sold to us. And increasingly, things like security, safety, trump old-fashioned things like principles, things that motivate people to go into politics in the first place. So the politicians, some politicians anyway, begin to seem more like managers rather than representatives, which I think is a terribly sad thing. So why, in this sort of changed political terrain, why bother to participate if you're so obviously powerless? When everything seems to be centralised and the state seems to be more automated. I'm not here arguing for a smaller state. I'm arguing for a state which recognises individual liberty, which is part of a tradition which is part of the right and the left of recognising letting the individual flourish, letting the individual have some sort of control. And it doesn't help when legislation which governs these kind of things, anti-terror laws, surveillance, ID cards, censorship, are rushed through Parliament, hammered through Parliament in some cases, with very little debate. So the skeins of trust, which kind of link us to politics, are broken one by one when people see these kind of things. When, famously in 2005, when anti-terror laws were rushed through at enormous speed, and then again in 2008, when it looked somewhat shabby the way that the anti-terror bill was actually pursued against the wishes of Gordon Brown's own party. So MPs look increasingly servile, they look like lobby fodder. In many cases it's fair, a lot it isn't. And it shows that the concern for the rights of citizens isn't contested well enough in Parliament. It's part of a dumbing down of debate in Parliament and a dumbing down of debate generally. The politics is being seen as trivial, marginal to people's interest.